Nin Delawise Gibu Begum Jij and Ebigwetnawaj. My name is Cheryl Simon, and my family is from PEI. But when we say Ebigwetnawaj, it's deeper than just being from the island. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that connection with land today. So hopefully you're all in the right room because I know that there's another presentation going on up on the third floor. So as I said, my name is Cheryl Simon, and in our language we say I'm Ulnu Abit, right? I'm one of the people, and I am a woman. I've worked for almost 20 years. It freaks me out when I measure things in decades now, but I worked for almost 20 years with Indigenous communities across the country, and then primarily focusing in Mi'kmaq. So today, when I was talking about Indigenous identity, I'm going to do that through a Mi'kmaq lens, just to be able to contextualize it and ground it a little bit more in terms of how some of these identity laws work. And for most of you, if you've ever seen my presentations before, I always start out with this picture. This is my son, Declan, and this was his first time harvesting sweetgrass. And so he was getting used to, the heat of the summer, the bugs, the smell of the sweetgrass patch, the rocky motion of me harvesting. And that is how I prefer to teach about Indigenous topics, but it's not always practical. So we have to bring a little bit of it in terms of the picture. He's now 13, so he's now able to do it on his own. But I'm also a porcupine quill maker and a black ash splint maker as well, basket maker. So a lot of my perspective of who I am as an Indigenous person comes from that land-based activity, because I find that when I'm out on the land or in the woods doing the same activity that my ancestors did, my grandparents did, my mom does, it peels away all of the issues with the Indian Act and kind of brings me back to what it means to be Ulnu Abid. I also am professor of Aboriginal and Indigenous law here at Schulich. I put that there to remind me to say it all the time. My cousin says that that's my side gig, that I am the quilt maker first, the artist first. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my family legacy. So this here is my grandfather, Francis Jadis, and he was born down in the Annapolis Valley here in Nova Scotia. But due to centralization, his family got moved up to Sbeganagadi for the larger reserve. He met my grandmother, Mary Jane Peters, who was from Lennox Island in Ibikwit, known in English as PEI, and she was an islander through and through. So even though they traveled a lot through the territory, Lennox was home. And then this is my mother and her surviving siblings. Graham had 14 pregnancies, 9 babies, and 7 children, of which 4 of them are still with us. And then these are my 2 children, Carolyn on top doing porcupine quill work, and Declan on the bottom freaked out about poison ivy when we were harvesting black ash. But this family legacy is what the government wants me to focus on, because I don't know if you've noticed, my father is not here, nor is my husband. Because according to the government, when it comes to indigeneity, even like with my children, with myself, they disrupt it more than they are included in the family. So this system that we're going to talk about is the distinction between being part of a family and then having other people carve you off, and primarily for economic reasons. So the overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight, we're going to start out with some terminology. I try to think of things that I might be saying, but if there's other questions that you have, what other words that you've heard that people use for Indigenous people, feel free to ask. Then we're going to talk about Mi'kmaq identity and treaty making, because that really grounds the conversation about, when we were dealing with the British government, how did we talk about ourselves? What got recorded? Whose authority was at play? Then we're going to talk about colonial disruption and status, Indian status under the Indian Act, and then kind of move it back out to reasserting jurisdiction from an Indigenous point of view, a Mi'kmaq point of view, over who we are in terms of our kinship and our families. So that is the plan. They always say you should say what you're going to do it, and then tell you that you've done it. So that's the first part. All right, so here is some terminology. So Ulnu and Ulnuk is what I used when I first introduced myself, and this is the Mi'kmaq translation for the people. And we use that not only to talk about humanoids, but also all of the other beings that we share our territory with. And so it's a very inclusive, very expansive way of looking at our connection with other beings, with the land. It's all wrapped up with it. Mi'kmaq and Mi'kmaq, both pronounced the same way, is a post-contact word for us as Olnu. The difference between the spelling is just grammatical, depending on whether or not it's an adjective or a noun. Well, it's still a verb though, but it's just grammar, right? In terms of the difference that it pronounced the same, and that is not offensive to people to say Mi'kmaq, right? This is kind of like the common language that we have today. Micmac, however, is the anglicized pronunciation of Mi'kmaq. So if you were to apply the English alphabet to it, that's where that word came from. And so some people still cling to it, even in our communities, but it definitely is something that is not really used anymore for that purpose. You probably had conversations about the big Dartmouth Mall as opposed to Micmac Mall, right? Like people are recognizing the fact that that is just not how we refer to ourselves. Mi'kma'ki is the name that we have for the land of the Mi'kmaq, or Ulnama'ki, depending which way you want to be doing it. And again, it's not really a distinction between the two, between living beings and the land. It's very, very connected with the two of them. And then these two, we have two different definitions of Indian in this country. So one of them is under the federal jurisdiction. They've given themselves jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians, and that's where they define who we are according to their own authority. And then we have Indian as well under the Constitution, and this is about self-governance and Aboriginal and treaty rights. So some people think that they're the same use, and the government likes to use the same words for things to kind of muddy the waters. But my opinion is that these are completely different definitions. One of them is definitely much more about supporting self-governance, and the other one is about unilateral authority and colonial authority. So are there any other words that you would like to find or want to throw at me before we move on? Like I said, I think this is probably maybe First Nations. It might be one.
Difference between Aboriginal and Indigenous.
So Aboriginal actually means the people that were on a territory before Europeans arrived. So when we talk about Aboriginal rights, that's where that comes from, right? In terms of, we were here, Europeans showed up, so corresponding rights has to do, just our connection with the territory and whatnot. Indigenous doesn't actually have a clear definition. It's used more in international law, and the more important part of it is the Indigenous peoples, because the peoples is what recognizing a group, a collective, as a self-governing entity, as opposed to just being like another ethnic group. So those are the distinctions between those two. The word First Nation is more often just used for a band, an Indian band under the government's authority. And in the 90s, when people really started pushing for, no, we are nations in this country, the government said, okay, and then you started using First Nation instead of band. But they're not actually talking about the broader nation, and that's problematic. So just like the two Indians, they like to conflate words, and it really gets confusing. But that is definitely something I know I personally don't like to use it. I'm a member of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm part of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Abiguit First Nation is just a colonial construct, my band. Anything else? Does that cover most of them? All righty, let's start getting into the nitty-gritty then. I was really looking to see how I was going to start describing how we define ourselves in terms of Mi'kmaq identity. And it's a really interesting system of kinship and belonging. So we have what they say a very horizontal system of governance. We're very widespread. We have very, very far-reaching kinship ties. And part of it has to do with the fact that we weren't allowed to marry cousins, and you weren't able to marry people within your village, right? Because you were just deemed to be too close. We also have other relationships that are not biological that were prohibited as well. So you had to go farther afield to find your spouse. And so because of that, that's where the political power comes from in our territory. So we have these widespread kinship ties, and that's where people get their authority for leadership, and that's where our sense of family comes from. So it's really, really interconnected and very horizontal compared to other systems where are a little bit more rigid. I had mentioned earlier that there's no difference between us and the land. There was one chief that talks about we are as a blade of grass coming through the earth, right? Like that we're just so connected that you can't separate us. And this idea that an individual would have a sense of self removed from the nation and removed from the land is just foreign. right? Even family groupings in villages, they would not have had a sense of themselves separate from the larger nation, right? The collective was paramount. And it's really kind of hard to wrap your mind around that in a very individualistic world that we live today. But it's still definitely something that I've noticed with even with my children, just constantly up against the forces of society. Telling me, have you considered other people? Have you looked around other people? What does that mean for other people? And trying to really, really entrench it, this idea that you really have to look at the collective. That is what you need to put your focus on. I put this phrase here, Nina Ulnu, which is I am one of the people, I'm one of the beings of this land, right? That's how you would say it in Mi'kmaq, Nina Ulnu. My mom really likes that phrase. So when I was thinking about how to describe it, that's where I started with, well, what was I taught? What were the words that we use in my family? And that is definitely what we would use. I really like this quote here from Charlie Labrador, because again, it kind of has that interaction between the collective and the land. So I'll read it here. If you look beneath the forest floor, you will see that the trees, different species, are all holding hands. Right, so this idea that it was not individualistic and the collective, I cannot stress that enough. But I absolutely love that because when I first started harvesting on our territory, learning about roots and trees and how to do it, all of my knowledge keepers kept doing this, right? It's just this, Cheryl, like it's all interconnected. So this idea of balance and interconnectedness is really at the core of our worldview when it comes to our identity. And then I was looking at some other books, like, well, how do people describe it? And there's one academic, William Wickham, that has written extensively about Mi'kmaq culture, but I didn't want to elevate him too much either. So this is why I have this heading as describing Mi'kmaq identity. How have other people said it, but recognizing as well that he's not part of our culture. So there's these two parts here. The first one is, again, I'll read it to you. In order to keep alive the memory and to preserve the tradition from father to son, the history of their ancestors, and the fine example of their fine actions and of their greatest qualities, something which would otherwise be lost to them, and would deprive them of a knowledge of their relationships, which they preserve by this means, and it serves to transmit their alliances to posterity. What he's talking about, and we see this in contemporary use, whenever you meet another Indigenous person, who are your people, where are you from? And some people get like a little bit nervous about that. But what you're doing is, one, you're contextualizing your relationship with the land and the families, but you're also telling people what is that larger kinship group that you are a part of. And so you not only carry the responsibility of making sure that their histories, their stories, their identities are not lost because it's not linear, but you also have the weight or the responsibility to do your part to keep things positive and keep things in balance as well. So it's a really, this idea of who are your people, where are you from, it seems so simple, but it's also a really beautiful way of continuing like that connection with your ancestors. And every time we meet somebody, that's what we're doing. So it really follows a lot of Indigenous law when it comes to why we say that, what we're articulating, and what we mean when we do it. So here's William Wickham's quote. Just in terms of like how did people at the time of the treaties describe Mi'kmaq life? So this idea that shared histories, shared use of the land, shared labor, the kinship, everything was deeply ingrained. So I just put this up. This is how other people have described who we are. And I mentioned the treaties, right? And at the beginning, I was saying that we're going to talk about how identity relates to the treaties. And so there's a few things to be aware of before we start talking about it, is that treaties are evidence of our nationhood. And so only nations can enter into treaties. The provinces would probably like to, but they can't. Only Canada can. So when you look at the fact that Mi'kmaq people have treaties, it is evidence of our nationhood. And when they were signed, we had a lot of political and military power in this territory in the 18th century. We were formidable people, like some of our allies in Boston. If they wanted to threaten people, we're going to bring down the Mi'kmaq, right? The warriors come. The Innu says that, I've heard one person say that one thing that the two things they knew about Mi'kmaq people was that they were really good at seafaring, just boating, and we used to go and steal women. I'm hoping that means we were like charming and attractive, but I also suspect we may not have been. Um, but what's important to know is that during this time of treaty making, the laws that were in effect were Mi'kmaq. right? So the British had their system, the common law, but the Mi'kmaq laws were absolutely in effect. And so one way of saying that is Mi'kmaq will de on, right? The way that we govern ourselves. There's many different ways of talking about laws because it's part of everyday life. Everything has to be kept in balance. You've got that weight of all your ancestors and the people who've come before. And every day, all of your actions, you have to be making decisions and by keeping things in balance. Am I following my protocols? Am I following the laws? And that included the treaty making process. So there is no way that the British government ever would have had anything to do with how the Mi'kmaq people were defining themselves in their territory at that time. But the words are written in English. So given that, you have to consider the Mi'kmaq worldview, our language, and our culture in order to interpret what those words mean. People these days like to kind of pick out words from the treaties. This is what it means, and this is how it benefits me. But that's not the way that you have to read them. You have to look at that really expansive worldview that's contained within. And like we would never have a role in saying, well, who gets to be an American citizen? Or the Americans, they can't determine who Canadian citizens are. It was the same way. So at the treaty making time, Mi'kmaq law applied. And let's look at some of the language. This is one of my favorite ones from Treaty of 1752. This is a copy of the parchment. I always encourage people, if you want to take a look at some of our treaties, they're just across kitty corner at the archives. So you can actually go and take a look at the documents. So this language that the members and the delegates of the said tribe, right, speaking about the Mi'kmaq, for themselves and their said tribe, their heirs and their heirs of their heirs forever. I find it very poetic, right? And this idea that it was inclusive and it wasn't going to end, right? It wasn't assimilative. And this idea that, like, if you think about that broad kinship network that I mentioned in terms of our governance, when they're putting language in like that, it's capturing that expanse. And when we talk about everybody, like we always joke that we're always related, but we really always are. And so this idea that, the inclusiveness of it was really critical in terms of capturing that worldview in terms of who we are as Mi'kmaq people. So let's get on to the colonial disruption then, in terms of what happened. I've been doing a lot of reading lately about these concept of race and kind of what was at play during this time in history. And as I mentioned before, Mi'kmaq people were a very formidable military threat. But as a result of that, the colonial authorities were only concerned with men that were of age, that were warriors. So even in the early census that were taking place in the colony of Nova Scotia, they were only focusing on men, right? This idea of the role of women, of children, these broader kinship networks, that wasn't something that they were concerned about. They weren't recording, or none of that took place. So when you have a body of people that you are scared of and you are looking at it as a formidable military threat, it does alter the way that you view them. There's a local historian that talks about people cowering in the forts at Halifax, terrified to even go get wood outside of the fort because they were worried that the Mi'kmaq people were going to get them, right? So it really plays on people's psyches when they think of that. So this idea that we were a very strong military threat. And unlike the French, the British had no interest in integration in terms of getting to know our systems of government, our language, or anything like that. But this foundation of race was happening at the same time. And so what I've been reading, there's actually, this is a quote here from an Irish academic who is in France right now teaching at the Sorbonne, and he's really turned his mind as to during the 18th century, the rise of the concept of race in terms of how British people saw themselves, right? So you have to kind of think about, at that time, we have the divine right of kings, right? We have a king that has ultimate authority in God's own image, given him domain over all, according to a Christian Bible. And then how are they subjugating people, right? It had to do with blood and bloodline and purity. Right? So think about how noble people married, how they viewed themselves. Like they even, like people that worked in fields were swarthy, right? Like skin color, everything like this. So they had these concepts about what their sense of nobility, where it came from. Then they started getting all of these reports from across the world, from different empires and different, travels, that people that weren't that looked different. And they were trying to figure out, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? And so given the strict hierarchy of society, and like I said, like the Christian model and everything like this, it really had to do with maintaining that hierarchy and the purity and the bloodlines. And so they were trying to wrap their minds around how can they describe these reports. And so we see a lot of social Darwinism coming in, survival of the fittest. There has to be a hierarchy, there has to be people that are less civilized, with a lot of pseudoscience. So you see people, measuring craniums, trying to figure out, well, how come the kids' heads are not the same shape as the parents' heads? They should be, based on this idea. There was people that thought that every child was perfectly formed inside every parent, and then they weren't sure if it was the male or the female that passed the child. And they had all these different theories. They were trying to figure things out in terms of different people. There was different classifications. There was one scientist that came up with a six classification of people around the world, different colors, different parts of the world, different skin tones. They were trying to say, how deep does the skin tone go? If you change climate, does it change? Like a lot of pseudoscience. And there was also one, that British scientist that came on four races, like four classifications of humans: red, white, black, and yellow, which may be a bit familiar to some people in terms of like this ideas that were spreading through this time. But the purpose of it was to maintain the hierarchy, to maintain the supremacy over people and their role, as being the aristocrats and being at the top of power. So this idea of race is purely a social construct. And it has been debunked in terms of as science has advanced, all these different ideas and things. But the concept of race has stayed. Right? If you talk about Indigenous people, people will often talk about race. We have racism laws against it. I remember when I was working at the Department of Justice in Nunavut, they were trying to prohibit racism and had to invent the word for race in order to prohibit the racism that would flow from it, right? So it's purely a social construct. But people have really embodied it, that this idea that we are different races of people, but we're not. We're all human. And in the 17th or 18th century, they were trying to figure out why people were different from each other. So it's important to keep that in mind. One of the other things that we need to keep in mind is women. How are women viewed? I promise this is going to come to Canada. I promise it is. But it really helps to understand what happened to us. But if you don't have the foundation, it really seems like it just dropped out of the blue. So there is a legal doctrine, right? Again, like it's just a construct called coverture. And this had to do with what women were legally. And it's a fiction, this idea that when you are married, you become the same entity. There's no distinction between a married woman and her husband. And I think people are probably familiar with the persons case. Women were not persons under the law, because her husband was. And as a result, women couldn't own property because all of her property, because they were one, is now the husband's. They couldn't sign legal documents because that's what they had no legal recognition. They couldn't obtain an education against their husband's wish. They couldn't keep salary. They couldn't testify against their husbands because that would be self-incrimination because they're the same as the husband. And you've got that right to not have that. The only exception in England for all of this, regardless of whether you're aristocracy or not, was Queen Victoria, because they didn't want her husband to rule. So they made an exception for her, but every other woman, top to bottom in society, upon marriage, was the same as her husband. So this system was in place in the 1880s. So if you think about that military threat, focusing on men, looking at racism, and then this view of women, all of that came together in Nova Scotia and the different colonies when they were trying to figure out who Indigenous people are. I forgot to say, if you have any questions as I'm talking, feel free, because a lot of this, like I said, it will come together, but if you have questions about it. So because of that, all of that came together, and the colonies had different legislation to figure out who Indigenous people were. Right? So in 1876, after Canada was created, they consolidated all these different colonial pieces of legislation, and they also took the opportunity to define what an Indian was. And so an Indian is first and foremost any male person of Indian blood, a child of an Indian male, or a woman married to an Indian male. So the very act of an Indigenous woman giving birth doesn't mean that she's Indigenous or her child's Indigenous. right? It was all focused on that coverture. It depended on who the husband was. So this is why, with that doctrine of coverture, this is why if a non-Indian woman married an Indian man, she became an Indian because of coverture, unity of person. And if an Indigenous woman married a white man, she became white because, again, unity of person with that white man. This is legal fiction that stayed in Canada up until the 1980s, right? So in England, they got rid of it in the 1880s. We held on to it for another 100 years with respect to Indigenous women. Non-Indigenous women, of course, got the right to vote. They got, the person's case, everything like that. But we still have this in the Indian Act, and we still have remnants of it in the Indian Act today. But that is where this thought comes from. If a woman gave birth to an illegitimate child, always flummoxed people, right? They never knew what to do with them. So if an illegitimate child of a man, the child was deemed to be an Indian. The child, an illegitimate child, because there's no man, right? There was no man. They didn't know what to do with that. So it depends. And the Indian agent in communities could say whether or not the father was likely to have been an Indian or a non-Indian. And then that's how the person would get registered legally. They also had problems with widows, right? Women that float around without men attached to them. They really didn't like it. They weren't comfortable with it. So this system got absolutely ridiculous. And I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of it because it is absolutely ridiculous. And as a way to kind of highlight how this has gotten so perverse, I'll tell you on a personal level, I was born non-Indian. When I was 8, I became half an Indian. And when I had children with my non-Indian husband, I became eligible to be a full Indian. Yeah. What? That makes sense. Because what has happened is that this whole system is contrary to Indigenous law. It disrupts our systems of governance. It's overtly discriminatory, right? And it's hugely problematic. So as people have been challenging this, the government makes teeny tiny little changes to it, right? But they only fix the smaller problem. They don't fix the bigger problem of it. So the weird thing is that if I hadn't had children with my husband, I would have stayed half an Indian. Or if I'd had children with an Indian man, I would have stayed half because the children were okay because he would have been able to pass on status. Like, it's purely formulaic. It has all that pseudo silence regarding like breeding horses and dogs and like how to change people's ethnicity, like race. I shouldn't give them credit to say ethnicity, race. All of that is embedded with the approach to the application of status. And you couldn't be more removed from that widespread kinship ties that we were talking about, right? Where, like, it's just completely at the opposite. So in 1985, there was court cases, not wins in Canada, wins at the United Nations level, where we finally moved away from coverture. And the problem was, though, they didn't retroactively deal with a lot of the problems. They didn't get rid of the Indian Act. They didn't address this fact that Indigenous women had been treated different from their brothers for years, right? They never dealt with any of that. They just said, no, we're just going to fix this problem. So now women, doesn't matter who you marry, you get to be Indigenous, or you get to be an Indian in your own right. I always warn people that equal oppression is not a solution to discrimination, right? But I fear sometimes that that's how people view it. So because now women got to keep their status upon marriage the way that the men did, and they could pass it on to their children the way that men can, people don't question the actual existence of the Indian Act. They just kind of take that, well, that's a win, right? We're moving forward. This is actually why I said I'm eligible to be a full Indian, because by the time some of these legal changes came about, I'd had enough of the whole system. I'm like, no, I'm out in the woods trying to figure out what it means to be Mi'kmaq and not worrying about status. Way easier a process to go through. So the term Indian is just that construct of the Indian Act, right? The government, when the dependency changed, the loyalists come up, it became a numbers game at that point. And the government had obligations to provide provisions to Indigenous people. Sir John A. Macdonald famously said, we'll give them enough to not so they don't starve, but not so they can't thrive. So that provision of goods meant that they wanted a classification of people so that they knew who they were dealing with. So it was only ever an administrative tool that they were using so that they could account for the outlay of goods to people, right? And people have some people were counted the days that they came by and like check numbers on heads, all this type of stuff. But it's really, it's not a great system. It's a very complex. There's over 14 different classifications. That's changed. I have to go back and count it. And they're proposing new amendments to the Indian Act that are currently underway. There's more consultations going through. So even though coverture as a foundation has lifted, the inequality continues, right? And some Indians, I don't know, don't have rights. Like it's really bizarre that there's a famous case in Newfoundland where there's a set of twins and one of them is an Indian and the other one's not, right? Like these systems are just, it's not based on family units or kinship or Indigenous views of their identity. I love this quote. So Canada keeps getting slammed legally for the system, right? Like it's discriminatory. It just flat out is. It's contributing to the genocide of Indigenous people, and they haven't been winning, but they're really, really refusing to give up jurisdiction. So this is a submission that the government of Canada made at the United Nations Human Rights Committee when they were challenged on the discriminatory provisions of the Indian Act and that definition of status and the effect it has on women. So I usually don't read my slides, but I'm going to read these ones tonight. Canada further submits that Indian status is not a marker of cultural identity. Canada submits that the authors conflate cultural identity and Indian status to too great a degree. There are many First Nations in Canada, and each has its own cultural identity, including cultural practices, languages, and religion. Indian status is not a legislated approximation of any First Nation culture. It is a determinant of eligibility for a range of specific benefits provided by the Government of Canada to individuals. I would argue that they don't teach its citizens that they don't talk about it that way, that they themselves are part of the conflation between Indigenous culture and identity and indigeneity with status. And I would also point out, they do not seem to be making that distinction clear to Canadians generally. Any thoughts about that? Because this is what our government argues, or has argued at the UN.
Who's eligible for clean water?
You would think everybody is a human right, but it's not. I always kind of look when there's boil water orders for cities of Calgary, for instance, and how quickly those issues get resolved. And yet some First Nations have decades where they still are under the boil order or boil water orders. So this violation of human rights, human dignity, Indigenous law is something that is not changing. Any other questions or thoughts about this comment?
So many thoughts.
You want to share any?
Not for sure. um, because it's going to, whatever I say is probably going to be very politically incorrect. This basically sounds as though you're making a choice. Sort of, gee, I think I'll be Presbyterian and not Roman Catholic now. Mm-hmm. That's how this reads to me. It's just.
And what's really terrifying about this is that if you don't, what is the effect of not having status on a reserve, right? Because my mother had that happen. She married a non-Indian, lost her status. So being like reserves are lands reserved for Indians. She wouldn't have been able to be buried in the cemetery with her family on reserve. She lost her job. She got, lost her housing. Everything changed that day that she got married. Right. And the fact that they call it a cradle to grave piece of legislation because it determines everything from your birth right up until your death. But I would argue even beyond the fact that they prevented people from getting buried with their families for some reason just really sticks in my craw. Like I find that just like such an indignity, right? That when you got stripped of it, you were gone. And so for them to say, but you're still part of your family, you're still part of your culture, what are you talking about? We completely removed you from everything for decades or generations.
Yeah, I find their range of specific benefits provided to women in Canada fascinating word.
And this word.
To individuals, but the fact that they're conflating benefit and right. So like the benefit of having access to reserved territories that are on the rightful lands of like just like the and that like they're so generous to the giving this to the individuals like that. Yeah.
Purely an administrative function. What are you worried about? This doesn't affect anybody.
Cheryl, just going back a generation, say your mom or your grandmother, would they have been informed of what the repercussions were if they married a non-Indian?
I might get a little emotional answering this because in my family, it's MMIWG. They knew. Women disappeared. Because like if your marriage broke down, you could not go home, right? So because you were no longer an Indian. So my Aunt Josephine couldn't go home. It had been like when the marriage broke down and they found her body, right? And there was never any record of an investigation or anything that we didn't even know where she was for a long time. So because of that, like would people think about, leaving the reserve as something of prosperity? Sometimes I think people think like this is an economic thing, like you'll be better off or whatever. But read the MMIWG report. We know now what happened to a lot of those women that got kicked out. And when my mom got married, I wrote a paper about my family's interaction with the Indian Act. One thing I didn't mention in it was that when my grandfather they were at the back of the church and they were about to walk down the aisle. And like, again, my great aunt had just, like not too long ago been found. And my grandfather said, Judy, are you sure? Because they knew. And the way that the system worked is like any kind of systemic racist system is that it makes people in the system do racist things. So the person who actually submitted the paperwork to strip my mom of her status was her brother. Her brother, because he was on council, right? So this system is insidious in terms of how much it's gotten like roots to people in terms of it. So people knew, and to this day, when I hear people say, "Oh, like don't like marry your own, don't marry out," I don't look at it as necessarily racism, but terror from the MMIWG because they knew what might happen to these women, right? And it shifts. Like you have a lot of people that would say, "Well, I only want to have children with somebody who's a full Indian." You should never be making decisions about your family based on a government piece of paper, right? But it's safer to do that. And it was safer for a long time to do that because then you didn't have to worry about your kids getting kicked out of your community and your family. So people knew. But the problem was Canadians don't pay attention to it, right? Like we were at a murdered and missing march the other day, and there was very few people there, right? Very little attention especially compared to the TRC report. So this issue is often being kind of contextualized as like a fight for human rights versus self-governance when it comes to the politics of it. But it is human rights is what we're talking about. And the government is kidding itself, I would argue being a bit disingenuous. I know this is being recorded. Can I say that in public? They're being disingenuous in terms of making this type of submission, that it was only an administrative function, right? That it wasn't having the effect that it did. Yeah.
A young woman from Connecticut came up to Bear River and married Greg, the lady became chief. But anyways, and she got status,
Mm-hmm.
and they divorced. And I'm just wondering now. I'm wondering where she is now. Does she still have that status?
She has to have the status because there's no way of getting rid of your status. Right. So if a woman had gotten status through marriage, when they got divorced and she moves away from the community, whatever, she doesn't lose it. You can't deregister yourself from this system. Canada also doesn't recognize American Indigenous peoples under our system. So in Montana, for instance, if you have a Blackfoot in Alberta marrying a Blackfeet in Montana, the government views them as white, right? Which then has an impact on the kids, passing on identity, all this type of stuff. So it's really, the impact is real, and when I read this, it just makes me angry, right? It really makes. My whole career has been spent on the trauma of when I was in my 20s with all this stuff, right? I'm like, well, at least it's been a motivator in my life. But yeah, so status is not culture. It never has been. And this idea, when I talk with people, it's like being on the land and doing my art has made me come up with an idea, made me develop my identity as a Mi'kmaq woman, without all of the trauma of the Indian Act, right? But not everybody goes through that process, or some people have it where they were so removed from the culture because like they were scooped or adopted out, or whatever, they only have this status. Like what else do they have to kind of reconnect them, right? So it's really traumatic. And what are we left with after this, right? Because it's been over 7 generations now that we've been under the Indian Act status definition. This is a cultural iceberg. I show people this all the time. But this idea that race is a social construct is not real, right? Status is not about culture. What is culture? But because the government has allowed people to be of the belief that it's a bloodline, it's something that you can lose, that gets watered down, that, you can, after a couple of successive generations, you're white, people start thinking that it's only genealogy and it's not about living culture, right? That it's nothing more than a drop of blood, because the government has said that's what matters the most. So this cultural iceberg at the bottom is all of the things that you can't see with people. I would argue that the stuff on top is easier to be performative about. What kind of clothes are you wearing? Do you go to powwows? Do you dance? What kind of jewelry? Are you speaking English? Or are you not? Even genders. Like some First Nations have up to like 6 genders in their culture. And the idea that there's only 2, like not like settler society is having really big issues with that. It's like, well, that actually is a colonial imposition. The idea that there could only be 2. Yeah, so you look at clothes and age and what language you're speaking, skin tone, all that kind of stuff, right? Very, very surface level. But how do you get down to that collective life experience, that collective connection with the land? Bernie Francis says that even the way that our humor is, like the way that we laugh at things, is based on the structure of our language. Even if you're not a fluent speaker, you still laugh about things in a way that your family does, because of our language and because of our connection. Your worldview, your role in family, like all those really interconnected things. But none of this seems to make it into any of the dialogue when people are talking about indigeneity, right? They tend to focus more about the stuff that you see above water. Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of is making me think about the ways, like, I know you've spoken about this, the ways that institutions sort of insist on, like, even now, wants to have, like, certain documentation of your individuality, when that's such, like, a small part.
Yeah. But asking for a status card is easy. It is easy, right? It's got a card, it has your picture, it's got a number, it's got a little Canadian flag on it. It's easy, but it's horrific to think about how inaccurate it is with respect to indigeneity. So for that, if it's a focal point, it's scary, because all we're doing is propping up the unilateral authority of the federal government. Right? We're not getting into the kinship ties. It tends to like knowing that there's a second generation cutoff, and every band in this country has a date when there will nobody be eligible for status anymore. And it's happening on the East first because of the dynamics in our history. So every single band has that date when the government's work will have been accomplished. Right? It's still chugging along. It's still doing what it was meant to do. And people think, though, that it's culture, right? And they put that weight and that power to it. So what do we do about that? Reasserting, right? Because we had jurisdiction over this. And we still have First Nations that are working really hard and exercising their authority over who they are. And I find it really ironic sometimes when so much people are talking about our right to self-government. Well, the first question should be, well, who's self? Right? And if it's the government defining who self is, then it's got nothing to do with culture, by their own words. It has nothing to do with who you are as a nation. So we've got so these are some issues. And I mean, I sat there and actually edited the list down because the font got so small, you couldn't even read it with all the ones that I was going to put on. So this idea that nationhood, people think of the bands, those small little communities on those tiny little reserves. Those are not nations, right? Those are a collective of people within a broader nation. but there's no ability for the nation to kind of function, right? Because the government keeps everything focused on those small little groupings, small little families, and it's just not the broader nations that people are working at. Here's my point. Equal oppression between men and women is not a solution in terms of taking back our power when it comes to who we are and who our children are and who we like, the decisions that we make. Excuse me. Status doesn't differentiate between Indigenous nations. So the government doesn't care if I, as a Mi'kmaq woman, marry somebody who's Salish, right? That one Indian makes a full Indian for the kids. Well, but one Mi'kmaq and one Salish, what are the kids? Are they half? Like, like all this type of stuff? Like, is it the clan system? Like, how does it work? And the idea that you have to choose one. Everybody has two sets of parents. Some people are fortunate enough to have more parental figures in their lives. And think about all your grandparents. This idea that you have to pick one is definitely something as well that's been imposed, right? It strips out the other half of your family. We've got such an internalization of concepts of bloodline and race. And people will say, well, how else are we going to know who to pay money to? It treats people like an economic burden. And I love when Pam Palmer used to talk about the fact that if you lose your job, your solution is not to kick out some of your kids, right? Usually you come together as a family and try to work that out. But this idea that that you have to exclude people because they're an economic burden, as opposed to thinking, well, if we expand and bring more people in, we actually are diversifying and we're going to have more opportunities, right? Like all the studies show the opposite. But what you hear from people, oh, there's going to be 100,000 more people eligible for status. We won't be able to afford that. Well, the government's not affording it, right? So, or deliberately keeping the money out. There's that point there about the cutoff will result in no more status Indians. Again, has nothing to do with indigeneity. That doesn't mean Indigenous people are going away. That just means that the government's objective of lessening their economic burden will probably be fulfilled. There's a perception as well, and I'm not even going to use the phrase that people are using because it drives me nuts, but we've had active genocide, right? We have findings of that, and Canadians, I find sometimes object more to the label of genocide than they did to the acts of genocide that have been created. So genocide has been working, right? And we've had these systems working to tear apart our families, to tear apart our Indigenous identity. And so there's a lot of people that have been stripped of their connection. They've been stripped of their kinship ties. They don't know who they are. And I think that there's a perception out there, I know, I've borne witness to, this idea that if people don't know their family or they don't know which community they come, that's fraud. That's not what fraud is. Fraud is a very deliberate act, right? When you're construing yourself, you might have a small claim to indigeneity. You might not know how to articulate it or where you're from, but that doesn't mean that you're committing fraud, right? So it's almost like a witch hunt that's been going on in terms of people, and they take those ideas of who are your people, where are you from, and our own trauma gets weaponized against people. And we have people that are trying to find their families and they start getting scared, right? Well, how can I ask those questions in this climate? So this is a really big issue that we need to face as a society, on both sides of it. No Indigenous institutions to interpret Indigenous identity, right? If we write an Indigenous law saying that these are who our kinship, our kin are, and this is the criteria that people can meet and become part of our nation, then the only recourse that gets challenged or interpreted is the colonial courts. It's the colonial system. You'll have a non-Indigenous judge likely working through that. We have no mechanism for the Mi'kmaq nation to kind of deal with claims of people as to whether or not they're Mi'kmaq. Right? It's easy when you have clear connections with your family. Like I said, this is my mom, this is my grandparents, this type of stuff. That's easy. But if we're dealing with people that have been adopted out and they're trying to find, how are they going to deal with it versus the people that are actively trying to commit the fraud, right? Then there's no mechanism for them to come up in front of the Mi'kmaq nation and spell out why they think they're part of us. So this is a pretty big problem. It's also all counter to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Article 33 talks about the right to determine your own identity or membership, right? And again, I kind of don't like that they have the word membership there because the Indian Act refers to membership as well. And again, we have all of these words that they use the same word in different ways. And I kind of worry that will solidify for people the band, membership to a band versus membership as a citizen to a nation. Right? But that's semantics. That's something that we need to work out. Faith?
Do you know the Mi'kmaq word for would you say a little bit wealthy if you're
The trickster me is like Canada. No, but it's this idea that like so the word that we have for community. When you think about like Umsit Nogma, right? All my relations, right? And we say that after like every time we pray after every ceremony, Umsit Nogma, right? That's everything that's past, that's yet to be, all the different beings. It's a very expansive, inclusive term, right? So Umsit Nogma would be what would come to mind about that. That is our connection with everything, which again is the exact opposite of all the exclusionary whittle people down. Kind of, yeah. And it's fun to say, right? Umsit Nogma. So if you ever hear that, that's what that means. Yeah.
So, when you say that, because I have had it explained to me, of like thinking of people as Indigenous people as citizens of the nation, do you think that's a better phrasing in our colonial vocabulary, or is there not really a good?
This is something that when I was working with nations across the country, we used to talk a lot about, because if you use a word in English, people will have an automatic affiliation with that word, right? And I said, well, as a Mi'kmaq nation, we're going to draft a constitution. Everybody's going to know, oh, I know what a constitution is. Canada has one. You know, the Americans have one. Well, let's not talk about theirs right now. But this idea that if we say citizen, then it makes people understand that we're talking about something broader. We're talking about something that has rights, responsibilities, something that people can join, right? You can have a citizenship test. You can join. There was a First Nation in Ontario who granted full membership, voting rights, everything to a non-Indigenous person because he had been living in the community, knew the language, knew the culture, was part, like belonged to the community, right? So this idea that if you use citizen, it changes the dialogue away from race, which I like, but it's English. And so then you have to think, okay, well, is that good for explaining it to settlers? Or should we use the indigenous, like our Mi'kmaq word, and then make everybody learn it, right? And both have their pros and cons, because if it ever has to go up to a colonial court, they're not going to know the meaning of the indigenous word, but they would know what citizen means, right? So it's not something to be decided lightly, and it's something that if you believe in self-governance, you have to give people the ability to make their own decision. So that's good. What do people think about that? Is that, or do you prefer citizen, or the like anybody coming out on one side or the other on that?
I've lived in some other cultures where English wouldn't reflect the reality, so we would adopt whatever word the native population adopted.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting when you have these white people using words that would have been foreign to them, but they gain acceptance of them, and it becomes a word they can use regularly.
Yeah, I remember I saw on Facebook one time somebody was saying, you know, you're from Nova Scotia if you can pronounce Musquedobbit, Gitchmagoochik, and I can't remember what the third one was. I'm like, oh, so if you can speak Mi'kmaq, right? Those are Mi'kmaq words. But in the early days, the courts were saying that, you know, indigenous systems are too complex and basically have always kind of shielded settlers from the complexities of indigenous languages or expectations that they can learn it, right? There's this idea that indigenous languages are only for indigenous people, indigenous laws are only for indigenous people, but what if it's not, right? What if actually having people speak the language and use the words and come to understand it, would that help lower these barriers in terms of, you know, what we talked about tonight? So, yeah, Faith?
What mechanisms do you think would be in place? So let's say we were to import like a Mi'kmaq word, right? Self-governed. I'm going to use this word to describe these sorts of systems and processes. The common law system likes to really narrow in and restrict and define things to no end for these types of things. Economic growth and prosperity for capitalists, like, I don't know, open and broad. But what would you do if we were to import it, like safeguards?
Oh, safeguards is an interesting. Basically, we need to have our own autonomy over this stuff, right? We need to have a system in place that is not a unilateral assumption of jurisdiction over somebody, right? That's not oppressive. So thinking about, well, what do we do with this, right? What's the solution to this? What do we do in 2025 with this issue that's been around far, far too long? There is an advancement of a civic model of indigeneity, which I absolutely agree to, with this idea that it's a combination of kinship and belonging. But the critical thing to this is that it's belonging by the nation, right? Because this, like, some people look to the government for the validation of their claims. But what if they had to look to our governments for the validation of the claims, right? Because right now, any type of system like that doesn't work. And I remember my community had some troubling criteria for being part of the community. And one of my Mi'kmaq students said, "You know how I know that that's not really Mi'kmaq?" I said, "What?" She said, "Because when other Mi'kmaq people look at it, they go like, 'What the hell is that?'" Right? This idea that it didn't resonate broadly within the nation, right, is definitely an indicator as to whether or not it's actually part of the culture or something that they've, brought in to suit purposes. We have to stop these piecemeal amendments to the Indian Act, right? Like it's absolutely ridiculous. Every time the government has a finding of discrimination, they change like one little thing, like this: I'm eligible to become a full Indian if I have kids with my non-Indigenous husband, right? That was the result of a court case. It's nonsensical. Like it is so nonsensical. But the scrapping the Indian Act doesn't ever seem to be a solution. And this was something that the current government had said that they would, the idea of committing to an alternative that nations can opt out of. And then that way it's not getting torn out for the people that are not ready for it, but it gives them an opportunity to kind of build capacity and do it on their own volition. That's empowering self-government, right? Like it's not, I think that is definitely something to consider. The government has to shift its role from jurisdiction and control and authority over to supporting and empowering Indigenous people, right? Like it sounds so simple, but if they have the responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for Indians, well, then maybe it is to support the people that are dealing with all of that as opposed to having to take on the burden of defining us for ourselves. And then this idea that Indigenous nations have to be recognized and empowered. There is no mechanism for the Mi'kmaq Nation to take action against people. Right, we have had it happen a few times, like when the Delgmuck decision, the hereditary system went to the Supreme Court of Canada, had standing, but there's no, like, the Mi'kmaq Nation is not a legal entity under the current state of the law, right? So if we're saying that the Mi'kmaq Nation needs to be developing its laws regarding identity, there's no mechanism for it. Nope, go to the bands. The bands aren't the nation, right? And if they start doing different things, what if if we have a Mi'kmaq person that doesn't meet the criteria for any of the bands, are they still Mi'kmaq, right? So it kind of, we need to address this issue. And then, as I said, that if we do have our laws developed, they need to be interpreted by the nation, right? Not by Canada. Like that just seems like it would make sense with respect to, like, we have the right to self-govern, define who self is, and then we get to say yay or nay to the people that are making the claims. But all of this right now is not really in the works. So I always end my presentations with a picture of a porcupine butt. So Lalio is Mi'kmaq for thank you, like for a group of people. And any questions? We have just a few minutes left. I meant to give more time for questions, but yes.
Cheryl, why wouldn't you, or why would you err to English as a language? I'm just thinking, in Britain, the Welsh and the Scots pushed back culturally and started to get back to their tribal culture based on their fight to regain their language that was taken away from them. So that Scots is now an official third language in Scotland. Welsh is now taught, and that was sort of the rebellion, was both in Wales and the Islands, was based on fighting for the language.
I agree, but where we don't have this yet, you run the risk of the colonial courts defining the words or interpreting them according to their own criteria, right? So I like the idea of decolonizing being, like I would tell my students, right, the idea that you have to neutralize the immediate effect, then you have to decolonize, build your capacity, and then you can indigenize. So this idea that we don't have to get it perfect. And so if we don't have the ability to enforce it within the nation, does it make sense to use English now and then move to the language? I'm kind of of the opinion we should just start using the language and make everybody else learn, right? But I have heard people make the counter argument, and I don't want to devalue their position on that. But it's my personal preference. I won't lie. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, I truly want to end on the porcupine. All right, so thank you. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody has anything they want to say in person as opposed to in front of the crowd.